In the last lecture module, we looked at the arguments that kornblith suggests Quine offers in favor of the replacement thesis. In this module, we're going to see that kornblith doesn't think those arguments actually support the replacement thesis as he's portrayed it so far, and that he'll distinguish between a strong version of the replacement thesis and a weak version of the replacement thesis. And so we'll talk about what the weak version of the replacement thesis might be, and we'll see that kornblith thinks that the second and third argument can at most support that, the weak replacement thesis. And in fact, kornblith thinks even this weak replacement thesis is stronger than what he needs. The weak replacement thesis is stronger than the view he calls psychologism. It's stronger because the weak replacement thesis could be false and psychologism could still be true. And the weak replacement thesis implies psychologism. And so we'll look at psychologism then. But even psychologism, kornblith says, is stronger than what he needs. So he'll distinguish again between psychologism and what he calls ballpark psychologism. And he'll say ballpark psychologism doesn't really even need an argument in favor of it. Anybody who rejects external world skepticism adheres to or assents to some version of ballpark psychologism. So it is ubiquitous, even amongst epistemologists. And it has the implications that kornblith wants. Ballpark psychologism, he thinks, implies mutual constraint between those first two questions. How ought I form my beliefs, and how do I form my beliefs? If we're ballpark psychologists, kornblith suggests, then those two questions really aren't completely independent of each other. And in fact, we would benefit by interacting with psychologists even if there was very little overlap between the questions themselves. And this ultimately is kornblith's argument for the naturalistic approach. Let's see how kornblith makes his case. Kornblith suggests that the latter two arguments, the rise of science argument and the rational presumption argument, they only really seem to support a weaker version of the replacement thesis. Whereas the strong version of the replacement thesis asserts that one should simply be replaced by two. The weaker version of the replacement thesis holds that one or two are going to provide answers to the other, so that they're independent and overlapping in a way that answering one will provide you with adequate answers to the other. So the weak version of the replacement thesis doesn't require that one or other discipline, philosophy or psychology, close up shop. Rather, each discipline would, in the full length of time, come up with answers to their questions that in fact provided answers to each other's questions. So that if psychology finished, philosophy needn't continue, or if philosophy finished, psychology needn't continue. Each discipline would of course have its own way of formulating important questions and its own methodology. Still, kornblith suggests, each discipline can and should benefit from each other. In other words, the weak replacement thesis seems to support the naturalistic approach. If answering one gives me my answer to two, then the psychologists ought to be talking to the philosophers. That couldn't possibly hurt, since they're both trying to come up with answers that are roughly equivalent to each other, and vice versa. If two can give me answers to one, well then the philosophers ought to be talking to the psychologists, because after all, what the psychologists are doing can provide answers to that question, how ought I form beliefs? But do we really need something that's as radical as the weak replacement thesis? And kornblith thinks not. Think of psychologism. Psychologism merely answers three affirmatively. Psychologism just says, well, we form beliefs as we ought. So psychologism is a weaker thesis than the weak replacement thesis, because it could be true while the weak replacement thesis is false, and it's implied by the weak replacement thesis. Kornblith's reasoning goes as follows. One might well hold that three is true, hence psychologism is true, but also hold that epistemology and psychology are asking questions at a fundamentally different level of generalization. Hence, one must answer both question 1 and question 2 to have the full picture of how we form beliefs and why we form beliefs as we ought. Answers to question 2 will technically provide us with the information necessary for answering question 1, but they aren't actually answers to question 1, and vice versa. So, psychologism is a weaker thesis than the weak replacement thesis. But we also notice that even if the weak replacement thesis proves false and psychologism true, each discipline would still place constraints on the other, and interaction would still be mutually beneficial. Still, psychologism is a stronger thesis than many philosophers might want to accept. So Kornblith moves to an even weaker thesis. He says, look, most philosophers, even traditional epistemologists, are going to hold what he calls ballpark psychologism. Ballpark psychologism holds that the ways in which humans form beliefs are, in fact, roughly how humans ought to form their beliefs. Though somewhat vague, Kornblith thinks, anybody who rejects external world skepticism, they've still got to hold ballpark psychologism. Even if one holds that epistemology is autonomous from psychology, and that epistemic truths can be known a priori, one still ought to hold that philosophers and psychologists can interact in ways that benefit both because of ballpark psychologism. After all, even if epistemic truths are knowable a priori, it doesn't follow that they're easily knowable. And so one might well benefit from occasionally checking one's theory against the world by talking to psychologists, since after all, we form beliefs roughly as we ought to, and so we can find out things about how we ought to form beliefs by talking to psychologists about how we in fact do form beliefs. So let's end this lecture roughly the way we began it, by noticing that Kornblith's line of argument here kind of begs the question against an entire group of epistemologists. Even if skepticism proves false, ballpark psychologism is only going to follow if one is a process theorist. Those who find merit in the arguments on paper thesis, they needn't accept any of the conclusions from this paper. And so in this way, Kornblith doesn't seem to engage with many of the epistemologists that you'd think he should or would or want to.